Shadows conceal the darkest secrets of the city, but even ruthless syndicates cannot hide from fate. A billionaire crime lord followed a simple triage nurse into the pouring rain, expecting to find an ordinary life. Instead, a single piece of paper waiting on her apartment door shattered his entire empire. According to sealed dispatch records from the Boston Police Department, the night of November 14th was categorized as unusually quiet. The bitter autumn chill had driven the city's usual suspects indoors. But inside the harsh, fluorescent-lit corridors of St. Jude's Medical Center, quiet was just a temporary illusion. Sophia Caldwell preferred the graveyard shift. At 26, she was a woman running on fumes, cheap black coffee, and a desperate need for overtime pay. St. Jude's was a crumbling institution on the edge of the South End, acting as a catch-all for the city's forgotten souls. It was here that fate, wrapped in a tailored Italian suit and bleeding profusely, crashed through the ambulance bay doors at exactly 2:14 a.m. The double doors violently swung open, not by paramedics, but by two men in dark overcoats. They were practically dragging a third man between them. "We need a doctor, now!" roared the taller of the two, a man later identified in federal indictments as Lorenzo Bianchi, a known enforcer for the city's most dangerous syndicate. The attending physician on duty, Dr. Harrison Bennett, froze. The chief of surgery was a brilliant man on paper, but he was notoriously cowardly when faced with the criminal element that often bled onto his pristine linoleum floors. Bennett took one look at the heavy, customized firearms bulging beneath the men's coats and instinctively took a step backward, stammering about police protocols. Sophia did not step back. Years of struggling against crushing debt and navigating a desperately hard life had stripped away her capacity for intimidation. She grabbed a pair of latex gloves from the wall dispenser, snapping them onto her wrists with a sharp crack that echoed in the paralyzed emergency room. "Put him on trauma bed 3, Sophia ordered, her voice completely devoid of fear. "And stop yelling. You're scaring the psychiatric hold in bed 5. Lorenzo glared at her, his hand twitching toward his waistband. "Do you know who this is, sweetheart?" "I don't care if he's the mayor of Boston," Sophia replied coolly, stepping into their personal space and grabbing a pair of trauma shears. "If you don't get him on that bed in 3 seconds, he's going to bleed out on my floor, and I just mopped." The man bleeding between them let out a low, raspy chuckle that turned into a cough. Matteo Falcone, the undisputed head of the Falcone crime family, lifted his head. He was striking, with sharp, aristocratic features, piercing dark eyes, and a jawline tight with pain. A bullet had grazed his side, and a jagged laceration ran across his left shoulder, tearing through thousands of dollars' worth of bespoke silk and wool. Matteo waved Lorenzo off with a weak but authoritative flick of his wrist. He climbed onto the gurney himself, his breathing shallow. "Do your job, nurse," Matteo murmured, his eyes locking onto hers. For the next 45 minutes, Sophia worked with surgical precision. Dr. Bennett eventually found his nerve enough to perform the suturing. But it was Sophia who controlled the room. She barked orders, monitored the vitals, and applied pressure to Matteo's wounds with hands that were remarkably steady. Throughout the ordeal, Matteo didn't make a sound. He refused the heavy painkillers, opting only for a local anesthetic. Instead of staring at the ceiling, his unyielding gaze remained fixed on Sophia. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration. He noticed the dark circles under her hazel eyes, the exhaustion lines framing her mouth, and the worn, scuffed edges of her white nursing clogs. She was beautiful, but it was a tired, fiercely guarded beauty. When the procedure was finally over, Dr. Bennett practically sprinted out of the trauma bay to fill out the mandatory gunshot wound reports that Lorenzo was already intercepting at the front desk with a thick stack of $100 bills. Left alone in the bay, Sophia began to clean up the sterile tray. She didn't offer a gentle bedside manner. She tossed the bloody gauze into the biohazard bin with a heavy sigh. "You didn't ask for my name," Matteo said, his voice surprisingly smooth despite the blood loss. "I don't need to know your name," Sophia replied, not looking up as she wiped down the stainless steel counter. "Names require paperwork. John Doe is much faster to file." Matteo leaned forward, wincing slightly as the fresh stitches pulled at his skin. "You saved my life tonight, S. Caldwell." He read the small plastic name tag pinned to her scrubs. "Most people tremble when my men walk into a room." "Most people haven't worked 3 double shifts in a row," Sophia deadpanned, finally turning to face him. "Trembling takes energy. I'm currently preserving mine for the walk to the bus stop." She walked over to the gurney and adjusted his IV line, her face inches from his. Matteo could smell the faint scent of vanilla and antiseptic soap on her skin. In his world, people were either terrified of him, trying to use him, or trying to kill him. This exhausted, unapologetic woman treated him like a minor inconvenience. It was the most intoxicating thing he had experienced in a decade. "Let me offer you a ride home," Matteo offered, the dangerous edge in his tone softening just a fraction. "I'd rather walk barefoot through broken glass," Sophia replied flatly. "Discharge papers are at the front desk. Keep the stitches dry, or you'll be back here. And next time, I might just let you bleed." With that, she turned on her heel and walked out of the trauma bay, leaving the most feared man on the eastern seaboard staring after her, captivated. Medical records show. Matteo Falcone signed himself out against medical advice exactly 2 hours after his arrival. But the physical exit did nothing to sever the psychological tether that had attached itself to him. Over the next week, the criminal underworld of Boston was thrown into chaos as the Falcone family brutally hunted down the men responsible for the ambush. Retaliation was swift and merciless. Yet even as Matteo sat at the head of opulent mahogany tables, orchestrating the systematic dismantling of his enemies, his mind kept wandering back to the harsh fluorescent lights of St. Jude's and the defiant hazel eyes of Sophia Caldwell. He had instructed his most trusted investigator, a former intelligence officer named Arthur Pendleton, to quietly pull a file on her. The dossier arrived on Matteo's desk 3 days later. Sophia's life was a masterclass in quiet desperation. She was an orphan, raising her younger sister, Lily, who suffered from a rare neurological disorder. Every penny Sophia earned went to specialists, experimental treatments, and keeping a roof over their heads. She had over $80,000 in medical debt and lived in a crumbling tenement building in Dorchester, owned by Arthur Higgins, a notorious slumlord. Matteo felt a strange, unfamiliar tightness in his chest as he read the file. He had unimaginable wealth at his fingertips. He could wipe away her debt with a single phone call. But he knew, with absolute certainty, that the fierce woman who had stood down a loaded gun would never accept his charity. She would see it as a coin. On a rainy Tuesday night, exactly 10 days after the hospital incident, Matteo's obsession reached a breaking point. He told his driver, Paulie Genko, to park the armored SUV 2 blocks away from St. Jude's. Matteo stepped out into the freezing downpour. pulling the collar of his black trench coat up against the wind. He waited in the shadows, across the street from the employee exit. At 3:15 a.m., the heavy metal door pushed open. Sophia stepped out into the rain. She looked smaller outside the hospital, shivering as she pulled a thin, inadequate raincoat over her scrubs. She didn't wait for a bus. She began to walk. Matteo followed. I didn't consider himself a stalker. In his twisted moral compass, he was simply ensuring her safe passage through a dangerous neighborhood. He moved swiftly, a phantom keeping pace half a block behind her. The rain masked his footsteps, washing away the grime of the city streets. He watched as she stopped at an all-night bodega, emerging a few minutes later with a small carton of milk and a loaf of discounted bread. The sheer normalcy of it, the pathetic, struggling reality of her existence, gnawed at Matteo's conscience. Finally, she arrived at her address. The building on 4th Street was a decaying brick monstrosity with a flickering street lamp out front. The front security door was propped open with a cinder block, a massive security risk that made Matteo's jaw clench in anger. Sophia disappeared inside. Matteo waited across the street in the shadows for 10 minutes. He intended to walk away. He had seen where she lived. His curiosity should have been satisfied, but a dark, protective instinct compelled him to move forward. He crossed the wet asphalt and stepped into the dim, foul-smelling lobby. The air was thick with the scent of damp rot and stale cigarettes. He climbed the creaking wooden stairs, his expensive leather shoes making no sound. He knew from Pendleton's dossier that she lived in apartment 3B. When Matteo reached the 3rd-floor landing, the hallway was bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a single dying bulb. He walked slowly down the corridor, the silence heavy and oppressive. He approached the door marked 3B. The pit was peeling, and the doorknob looked loose. He made a mental note to send his men to quietly replace the locks tomorrow. But as Matteo stepped directly in front of the door, his heart stopped. There, driven deep into the cheap wood of the door, was a 6-inch tactical hunting knife. Pinned beneath the heavy steel blade was a thick manila envelope and a Polaroid photograph. Matteo reached out, his hand trembling for the first time in his adult life. He gripped the handle of the knife and pulled it free with a dull shk sound. The envelope and the photo fluttered into his hands. He looked at the Polaroid first. His blood ran ice cold. It was a photograph of Sophia, taken through the window of this very apartment. She was sitting at a small kitchen table, counting pills into a daily organizer. But that wasn't what paralyzed the Mafia boss. Scrawled across the bottom of the photo in thick, red marker were 2 words: the Savior. Matteo aggressively tore open the manila envelope. Inside were dozens of surveillance photos. Photos of Matteo being dragged into the hospital, photos of Sophia treating him, photos of Sophia walking to the bus stop. And beneath the photos was a heavy cardstock letter, stamped with the wax seal of the O'Neill syndicate, Matteo's most ruthless rivals, led by the psychotic Finnegan O'Neill. The note was written in elegant, looping cursive. "Dearest Sophia, the Falcone bastard owes you his life. We know what you did in Trauma Room 3. Because of your healing hands, our war continues. That makes you an active participant in our city's bloodshed. Matteo Falcone is unreachable in his ivory towers, but you are right here in the mud with us. Bring him to the abandoned rail yards on 7th Avenue by midnight tomorrow. If you don't call him, if you don't lure him out, We will come back for your sweet sister, Lily. We know she sleeps in the room by the fire escape. Tick-tock, Nurse Caldwell. Matteo stared at the paper, the words burning into his retinas. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Sophia didn't know. The envelope had been pinned to the outside of her door while she was walking home. She was inside right now, taking off her wet coat, entirely unaware that the most vicious crime syndicate in Boston had just put a bounty on her head because of him, because she had done her job and saved his life. His enemies were going to butcher her and her innocent, sick sister. The silence of the hallway was suddenly broken by the sound of footsteps inside the apartment. The deadbolt clicked, and the doorknob began to turn. Sophia was opening the door. Matteo stood there in the dim light, the threatening note clutched in his fist. His dark eyes wid as the door slowly creaked open. The wall between their two worlds had just collapsed, and the fallout was going to be devastating. The cheap wooden door groaned on its hinges, swinging inward to reveal Sophia Caldwell. She was frozen in the entryway, one hand still gripping the brass knob, her exhaustion instantly evaporating into sharp, defensive adrenaline. She had just survived a grueling 14-hour shift, only to find the most dangerous man in Boston standing in her dimly lit hallway, gripping a 6-inch tactical hunting knife. "What the hell are you doing here?" Sophia's voice was a harsh whisper, her eyes darting from his imposing silhouette to the heavy blade in his hand. She didn't scream. Years of living in Dorchester's roughest corners had taught her that screaming only drew the attention of predators. Matteo Falcone didn't answer immediately. He stepped forward, his broad shoulders forcing her to step backward into the cramped living room. Before she could protest, he kicked the door shut behind him, engaging the flimsy deadbolt and throwing the chain lock into place. The sudden, suffocating proximity of him in her tiny apartment made the air feel dangerously thin. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, Sophia," Matteo said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that commanded absolute obedience. He held out the manila envelope and the Polaroid. "I followed you home to ensure you made it safely. I found this driven into your door." Sophia snatched the photo from his hand. The color instantly drained from her face, leaving her skin the color of ash. She stared at the image of herself sitting at this very kitchen table, the words "the Savior" slashed in red ink. Then her eyes fell upon the letter bearing the wax seal of the O'Neill syndicate. According to unsealed FBI wiretaps from the 2024 organized crime sweeps, Finnegan O'Neill was not a man who made empty threats. The O'Neill syndicate controlled the docks and the underground weapons trade, and Finnegan was notoriously sadistic, known for utilizing psychological warfare before dismantling his rivals. As Sophia read the letter, her breathing turned shallow and erratic. "Lily," she gasped, dropping the papers onto the linoleum floor. She turned and sprinted down the narrow hallway, pushing open a door adorned with faded butterfly stickers. Matteo followed her, his hand instinctively reaching beneath his coat to grip the handle of his customized Sig Sauer P226. Inside the small, meticulously clean bedroom, an 8-year-old girl was sleeping peacefully, the rhythmic beeping of a specialized pediatric BiPAP machine filling the silence. Lily Caldwell's chest rose and fell steadily. Sophia collapsed to her knees beside the bed, pressing her trembling forehead against the mattress, letting out a choked, desperate sob. Matteo stood in the doorway, the harsh reality of Sophia's existence hitting him like a physical blow. The room was filled with expensive, life-saving medical equipment that clearly cost more than the entire building was worth. This fierce, unyielding woman who had barked orders at Mafia enforcers was holding the fragile thread of her sister's life in her bare, blistered hands. "They know she's in the room by the fire escape," Sophia whispered, her voice breaking as she looked up at the rusted iron grating visible through the rain-streaked window. She turned to Matteo, her hazel eyes blazing with a mixture of terror and absolute fury. "You brought this to my door. You brought death to my sister, and I will be the one to bury it," Matteo replied, his tone as cold and hard as diamond. He pulled a burner phone from his pocket, dialing a secure line. "Arthur, it's Matteo. The O'Neill family has crossed the line. They left a bounty on the nurse from St. Jude's. Mobilize the extraction team to 4th Street. Bring the armored SUV and heavily armed escorts. We have a pediatric medical transport." I hung up and looked at Sophia. "Pack whatever medical supplies she needs for the next 48 hours. You have 5 minutes. "I am not going anywhere with you," Sophia hissed, standing up to block his path to Lily. "You're a criminal. If I go with you, I become an accessory. I'll call the police. I'll call the FBI. The police in this precinct are on Finnegan O'Neill's payroll." Matteo cut her off, stepping closer until he was looking directly down into her eyes. "If you call 911, the dispatch officer will alert Finnegan's men, and a hit squad disguised as officers will be here in 10 minutes. The FBI takes weeks to build a protective custody case. Finnegan gave you until midnight tomorrow, but men like him don't wait. It's a psychological trap. I want you panicked. He is likely watching the building right now." Sophia's mind raced, her medical training trying to compartmentalize the trauma. But this wasn't a bleeding patient. This was her life tearing apart at the seams. She looked at Lily's peaceful face, then back to the ruthless syndicate boss who was currently offering her the only viable shield against a monster. "If anything happens to her," Sophia warned, her voice dropping to a lethal octave, "I will take one of those scalpels from my bag, and I will sever your carotid artery myself." A ghost of a smile touched Matteo's lips. It was a terrifying, genuine expression of respect. "I would expect nothing less, Nurse Caldwell. Now pack the bags." For the next 4 minutes, the apartment was a blur of frantic, silent motion. Sophia packed Lily's medications, backup power supplies for the BiPAP, and a small duffel of clothes. Matteo moved to the living room, flipping the heavy wooden dining table onto its side to create a barricade near the window, his eyes scanning the rainy street below through the blinds. His burner phone buzzed. It was Lorenzo Bianchi. "Boss, we are turning onto 4th Street now. But things look wrong. There's a black Lincoln town car idling at the end of the alley, headlights off. 2 men just slipped into the fire escape alleyway." The twist in the pit of Matteo's stomach confirmed his worst suspicions. Finnegan O'Neill had never intended to wait until tomorrow night. The letter was a distraction to keep Sophia paralyzed with fear while the hitmen moved into position. "They're coming up the fire escape," Matteo said, his voice devoid of panic, purely tactical. He drew his weapon and racked the slide. "Lorenzo, hit the front door heavy. Take out the Lincoln. We are moving down the main stairwell." Matteo strode into the bedroom. Sophia had just gently woken Lily, wrapping the confused, sleepy child in a heavy blanket. "Keep her head down. Stay exactly 2 steps behind me. And if I tell you to run, you do not look back," Matteo ordered. He reached out and, surprisingly gently, placed his large, calloused hand over Lily's ear to muffle the impending noise. "Time to go," The hallway outside apartment 3B was suffocatingly quiet. Matteo moved with lethal, predatory grace, his customized Sig Sauer raised. He cleared the blind corners of the decaying tenement with the precision of a veteran tactician. Sophia followed mere inches behind him, her arms wrapped fiercely around Lily, burying the child's face in her shoulder to shield her from the nightmare unfolding. As they reached the second-floor landing, the deafening crash of shattering glass erupted from the apartment above. Heavy boots pounded against the floorboards. The O'Neill hitmen had breached the fire escape. "Move," Matteo commanded, in a harsh whisper, gripping Sophia's elbow and propelling her down the rotting wooden stairs. They hit the first-floor lobby just as the main entrance doors were violently kicked open. Two men clad in dark tactical gear and ski masks stormed the threshold, suppressed rifles raised. Instinct and training took over. Before the gunmen could level their weapons, Matteo shoved Sophia and Lily behind the solid brick pillar of the stairwell. He stepped into the open, a solitary shield of bespoke wool and cold steel. The deafening cracks of his pistol shattered the lobby's confined space. He fired 3 times in rapid succession. The first attacker dropped instantly to the dirty linoleum. The second man managed a wild, reactive spray of bullets that chewed through the plaster above Matteo's head, showering them in white dust. Unfazed, Matteo pivoted and fired twice more. The second gunman collapsed against a row of rusted mailboxes, dead before he hit the ground. Through the shattered glass of the entrance, the chaotic roar of a street war echoed down 4th Street. Lorenzo Bianchi and Paulie Genco were laying down heavy suppressive fire from behind a massive black armored SUV, pinning down the remaining hitmen in the alleyway. "Go!" Matteo barked, hauling Sophia to her feet. They sprinted through the freezing rain. Paulie had the reinforced doors of the SUV thrown open. Matteo shoved Sophia and Lily into the cavernous, bulletproof back seat, climbing in right behind them. "Drive!" Matteo roared. The SUV's tires screamed against the slick asphalt, tearing away from the curb and plunging into the dark, rain-swept arteries of the interstate, leaving the bloody chaos of Dorchester far behind. The grueling 3-hour drive took them deep into the secluded mountains of western Massachusetts. The Falcone family's Berkshire compound was an impenetrable stone fortress, surrounded by high walls and armed patrols. Upon arrival, the sheer opulence of the safe house offered a jarring contrast to the violence they had just survived. Sophia and Lily were immediately escorted to a sprawling guest suite where a private physician was waiting to stabilize Lily's medical equipment. Hours later, with Lily finally asleep in a plush, king-sized bed, Sophia stepped out onto the master balcony. The storm had passed, leaving a heavy, impenetrable fog rolling through the valley. She was still in her scrubs, shivering in the damp night air. The heavy oak door opened, and Matteo stepped out to join her. He had shed his ruined suit for a simple black sweater, though the dangerous aura surrounding him remained undiminished. He moved to the stone balustrade, staring out into the abyss. "Finnegan O'Neill is dead," Matteo stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "Lorenzo's team intercepted him. The threat to your sister is permanently neutralized. You are safe." Sophia closed her eyes, releasing a ragged, shuddering breath. The trench warfare of her daily life had taught her that survival often required dark miracles. Tonight, she felt only overwhelming relief. "I can't go back," Sophia whispered, gripping the cold stone railing. "My job, the apartment. My whole life is gone. Matteo turned, his dark eyes tracing the exhausted, beautiful lines of her face. Your old life is gone, he agreed, stepping closer until she could feel the heat radiating from him. You saved my life, Sophia. That debt is absolute. I have arranged for a private pediatric specialist at Mass Gen to take over Lily's case, fully funded. Sophia searched his face. And what about you? Matteo reached out, his knuckles gently brushing a smear of plaster dust from her cheek. I followed a nurse home looking for a ghost, but what I found on your door changed everything. His thumb traced her jawline. You are under my protection now, Sophia. Always. Leaning into his touch, Sophia realized with absolute clarity that the most dangerous man she had ever met was her only sanctuary. The shadows still held threats, but beside Matteo Falcone, she knew she would never face them alone. If this story of dark loyalty, dangerous romance, and gripping survival kept you on the edge of your seat, don't let the journey end here. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with fellow true crime and mafia drama lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, pulse-pounding stories. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support helps us bring more incredible tales out of the shadows. Stay safe and stay tuned.